Donning the purple. First of all, one thing I want to get out of the way. I am I don't tend to give normal reviews anyway, but, and some people may be looking at this who aren't used to my style, because this is more of a Euro-y type game than I at least have been reviewing recently. I went through a little phase on Euros, but I've largely gotten away from them. And that's one of the reasons I want to say this. I'm probably not very qualified to be reviewing this one. I'm not a big fan of Euros, and this turns out to be a Euro. Secondly, my playthrough, if you watch that, and you should never approach my review videos, the intro's fine, but the review video without at least getting some feel for what's going on in the playthrough. I'm trying to actually capture some of the thoughts that I had during the playthroughs. But the playthrough is really the evidence of what I'm looking at. And they're not there to teach you the game. They're there to give you the context that, well, honestly, they're the reason for doing these. This is just the summation because people don't want to watch through the entirety of the playthroughs, and I understand that. But if you don't watch some of them, I think you miss sort of how the systems interact, and you can only really judge that for yourself when you're looking at it. Maybe only when you're playing the game, but at least it gives you a hint when you're actually seeing it go, as opposed to just my impressions. So again, this was a review copy for me, which, for whatever reason, I've gotten a little rush of recently. I'm not sure exactly why I was selected to review this. It's not, in my alley, but it is an Ancients game, and it is less Euro-y than a lot of Euros in certain aspects, and I'll try to touch on what I mean by that. Yet, and it's always easier to criticize a game than to praise it, but the criticisms come, they're easier to identify. So let me take a look at what my sort of major criticisms are. The first one, and probably the most important for me, although maybe not to you, is that this is not really representative of anything within Roman history. It is what you would term highly thematic. And if that makes you think, ooh, it's all about that, it's all cool, it's gonna represent, it's gonna be like Rome. Okay, there's two problems with that. You'll probably love it for that. And B, as opposed to being related strongly to the subject, which doesn't have to be a simulation, but something has to be related strongly to the subject to appeal to me in that way. Here, it feels like it's a sort of a window dressing. I'm not sure you could make this game without, it's designed around some kind of flawed understanding of trappings of Rome or something like that. But it's not like it would, be able to be moved and just say, oh, we're in China instead. Although maybe you could, because the true understanding just isn't there. In particular, the transference of heir between three major families. If a family survives and has an heir to the family, that would be the heir to the emperor, too. Period, the end. So this idea of continuing families doesn't make a lot of sense. You might be able to abstract that away and say, well, that's just bullshit meant to pander to the masses. Think of it more as maybe factional ideals or whatever. And that becomes a little bit more acceptable. But man, you're starting to have to do some hand waving. There are a number of other mechanisms in it that I'm just looking and saying, this ain't representing Rome in any sense of the word. It's not just that it's not, directly historically accurate. It's just that it really is that it doesn't represent at all. Okay. So, and there's a number of reasons for that. At least not without more explanation. So if there was like an explanation that enemies included claimants for the throne, for the imperial throne, but then why would the players not still be in it if those kind of enemies overran? You get more the feeling these are barbarians the way the game presents them. Yet they show up in places where barbarians wouldn't be showing up. And they act in ways that barbarians wouldn't be acting, to tell you the truth. Yeah. I have no way to link this to history. Most particularly, I have no way to link it to the history of Rome in the year that they claim, 193 AD, which is the year of 4 emperors. A great year to set a game in, but the game, of course, goes beyond that. It goes 4 years. It's the 4 years of maybe less than 4 emperors in general. But it's not even representative of a larger slice of that era, or a different era entirely, or anything like that. It just does not feel like Rome to me. Okay. The second criticism I have, let's get the bad stuff out of the way first. Why don't I go over, how the components work and everything? Yeah, we will. The second instance that I had was, I'm going to leave the last because that's also very personal. Was that okay, this ends up having a heavy reliance on, these are all personal, a heavy reliance on being able to pay attention and absorb a lot of information at once about the board state, I think. And notably some things that are tucked away somewhere. And in with that is also, and maybe some of that's because of playing with the expanded rules the first time. But let's be honest, I generally play a game once, and twice or 3 times if I'm lucky. So I would never get to the advanced play in any time, and certainly not in time to do the video. So I wanted to take a look at that. The more painful for me has to do with the components, which is to say, and this might be able to be solved with some player aid sheets, which is to say that the rules, I'm not going to say they're bad. I did find some issues where they were difficult for me to parse what was going on, and I made errors based on that. But they're hard to remember. And I think a lot of that, at least on my last video, and you can tell my frustration for these last 2 points really shows in that third playthrough video, is that the sequence of play is largely spelled out in this section. And honestly, it's just, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, some examples and 7, 8 pages that more or less are the sequence of play. Now, the sequence of play is reproduced in a minimal form on the rulebook, and in a very little bit more, slightly more informative form, but not really useful to me on these player aid cards. And that's the wrong side of the player aid card, where the phases are here. And you can see there's a little bit of iconography there, which doesn't work terribly well for me. And what it means is, to find out the specifics of a phase, you really kind of have to flip through them. Now, the problem there is that the phases have names that are kind of useful and kind of stick in my head, and I know most of what happens in the phase, but unfortunately there's no easy reference to just glance at and not miss elements of it. And likewise, what other elements were kind of important to keep an eye on that I found were troublesome. Some of those were some of the differences between the player cards and the end of turn events, which, granted, You do not have to play the game with all the advanced bells and whistles on it. So these things created some frustration in me. Another thing that created frustration for me was the calculability at the end of the game. Now, this is really common in a Euro, right? Where I could look at an action and more or less calculate how many victory points that action would get for me. And if that calculability is really simple, I'm cool with it. If it's so obscure that I don't even think that I can touch it, I hate it. Here, this may not be the worst case, although for me, it wasn't good today on this playthrough. But here I felt like I could calculate, but I would be taking too much time and effort on it. And if I felt like I was in a competitive game of it, and I always kind of do with these kind of games, I would probably take a lot of time to optimize what my play was. And I don't like burning my brain on what really is a matter of counting. I hate counting. a lot of this is counting in terms of optimizing your score. You're counting one set of points that you get from one action, one set from another, and you're not really looking at the broad effects, especially late in the game. Early in the game, broader effects are more important, and I had no problem. I didn't feel like I could calculate anything out at that point. In fact, I felt kind of confused, as in, well, I'm not sure it's even worth spending, a chip to do something, and made some errors in that way. Errors that I do not mind at all. I mean, but the way the rulebook is constructed, the lack of play, it's my own poor little brain, which no longer works like it used to. I don't know if I focus less on games now or whatever, but these factors all kind of added up to saying, yeah, I made a lot of mistakes. I'm used to making those mistakes in opposed play, honestly. Not just me, but the whole group kind of getting something wrong. And then I notice it in solo play. I used to be better at solo play in terms of nailing the rules down. Believe it or not, if you've seen my videos, I might say, good God, what the hell do you guys do? Yeah, quite often, rules just get gotten wrong in a group. And it's not until somebody really focuses on them and tries to parse them out very carefully and takes the time for it, which often isn't there in opposed play. Okay, what are the good points? Yeah. So despite all these things, and you would say, well, look at the frustration you had on that last turn, on the fourth turn, where you had all that counting going on, and when you realized how many bloody errors you made throughout play of the game. Been realizing they've been building up over time as I noticed them and as the designer noticed them. But honestly, there was a lot of frustration there. And I really, really dislike the historical insufficiency in terms of being at all representative because, and I explained this early in the video series, I don't know if it was the intro or the first video, a player who has little knowledge of the situation being represented might walk away with some real misconceptions from playing a game like this. You probably shouldn't be taking your historical knowledge from playing of games in general, although simulations tend to be better than Euros for this. But the thing is, this does seem to present a certain view that almost seems like it should be closer linked than it is. And this is sort of the gripe I have with Wallace's Struggle of Empires, which I'm just like, man, it almost does what I'd want it to do, but it's just so annoying in some issues. Some little facets of it just piss me off so much that they get under my skin. Now that is, I think, that tries a little harder to be representative, and so the errors are more glaring. Here, my reaction then becomes kind of like, okay, let's play this more like it's just an abstract and abstract in the sense that Carcassonne's an abstract. I can imagine there are farms and stuff, but I have no real link to a real reality. I'm making up a world when I'm looking at the game, and I feel like that's kind of what I have to do here. Okay. So what do I like? One thing I like about this is that it has a number of different mechanisms in it, but none of them are really, really heavy. So, for example, I'm usually not a fan of worker placement type games. This has a worker placement element, but it's pretty light. I am a fan of games, in fact, I don't know if I'm a fan of games that don't, that, have a real geographical element to them where where the geography of the board really reflects on what I need to know and do in order to play the game. That helps ground me to it. It's just something about my visual processing, whatever. And this has that. But it's not a really heavy part of the game. It's a piece of it. This has a fair amount of randomness in it. There's, these events that show up at the beginning of during each turn, kind of early part of the turn, which shake up the situation greatly and kind of mean that you can't really optimize your play with any assurance. There's enough chaos in the situation that you're not going to be able to take a turn and say, yep, I am set. Nothing bad can happen next turn. But you can mitigate the effects of these events, and you can do things to protect yourself from them. There's also a small amount of stuff you can do to other players that you can directly do. I mean, if they're the emperor, you can just kill them. You can pick off their senators in some cases. You can do things to mess with their victory points directly. You've got some things that help you catch up. Now, this is really important because no matter which version you're playing, players have a different starting position based on their starting card. They may also have advanced bonuses in terms of what the monuments do for them, but no matter what, everybody starts in a somewhat asymmetrical position. One person starts out as the emperor, one person starts out as the heir, which means when the emperor dies, they will likely become the next emperor, and one person starts out as the leading senator, which gives them a different set of advantages. Not much, honestly. The leading senator kind of sucks, but at least as far as I'm concerned, for an advantage. You also start off with, and this I really like, because not a lot of games do this, you have a hidden agenda. It's not worth a whole lot of points in the game. You probably can get it. All my players got their maximum hidden agenda points that they could. But it does give you something you want to focus on. And what's important about that is people can screw with it, but they don't know that they're doing so. So, I mean, if they're hurting you in some way, they may be hurting you worse than they think they are. It's basically what it comes down to. If they're doing things that do harm to you, it could be a worse situation than you expect. But I like games that give players something beyond sort of a fixed set of victory points that everybody can calculate. And I think this is more clever than sort of just, here's some hidden victory points that you get. Why is it more clever? Well, because this directs your action and people might get some idea of what you're working towards, especially as they learn that deck of cards. Let's keep thinking. I'm sure we have more thoughts. One thing about it is because those particular mechanisms that the game is built up out of, all sorts of different little pieces, talk about why I agreed to take this, but all sorts of little pieces. Because they're all kind of light, even though they have some significant interaction with each other, I don't feel like I really have to hurt my head trying to figure them out until it comes to the counting stage. I find in a lot of games that have a lot of different mechanisms thrown in, or that go really deep into a mechanism, a lot of the heavier Euros, I feel like you almost have to play it a couple of times to even have an idea of what you should be doing. You know, oh yeah, here's another little piece. There's a little bit of engine building in here. No, tiny bit. You know, I mean, everything's kind of in moderation, and that's kind of cool. A little bit of player attack, a little bit of worker placement, a little bit of a decent amount of randomness. But I gotta say, it doesn't smash into you. But what that means is maybe there's not as strong or as deep a strategy side to the game that some Euro players are going to enjoy. There's more of a reactive side to it. There are things you can do, again, but they're almost tactical things, like how you set up in terms of gameplay, not in terms of the scope of the operations involved. In terms of how you set up your estates and what how you're going to protect them from the random monsters. Okay. Why did I get into this? Why did I accept to take it? Well, I don't do a whole lot of research on a game. Especially when somebody's saying, hey, do you want to do this? And this one looked interesting for a couple of reasons to me. One is it clearly, had a tie-in to a board. That geographical function is really important to my enjoyment of the game. And it's not absolutely, it doesn't always apply. Something like Republic of Rome I really enjoy. But it tends to be a good determinator. If there's not a board, I often am left kind of like, well, I just couldn't link to the game properly. I couldn't get excited about what's going on in the same way. So that was one positive. Another that drew me in was the idea of there being happiness and there being a grain price table. And I thought the grain market would be maybe a more complex mechanism. But it's really not. It's just the cost of grain is kind of a randomized thing. Oh yeah, there's another thing in the historical side is all the grain. First of all, Rome produces grain. I mean, Italy produced grain, but it all went to Rome. So Italy produces grain, and then it gets distributed out to based on the number of provinces there are. That was another one that really grated on me. Okay. Anyway. There were a few little elements that I looked at and said, oh, this excites me. And I wouldn't have bought the game without maybe digging a little bit deeper or waiting and seeing some comments or something. But when somebody offers something for review, and these come so seldomly that I assume, there's maybe a little bit of a link to what my tastes are. This one, it's hard to see that I think it would be odd for someone to be used to my tastes and think that I would be a good choice for reviewing this. But on the other hand, maybe they know something about me that I don't, because I did enjoy certain aspects of it a great deal. And I would replay this, even with all those negatives I have. There's probably not solitaire, but yeah, I could see enjoying doing this with other people, certainly. Okay, let's take a look. The components are very high quality, actually. They did a good job on the board. You saw already, very pretty, has a fair amount of information on it. Maybe there could have been some place where a little bit more depth on the faces would be. That would help me. I don't know how many other people. These guys, they're double-sided, double-printed, different values on it. One's the advanced game, one's the regular game. Always a good idea use all sides of thing. Use as much as you can of the materials you're providing. So like, if you could provide a second side of the board, I'm always in favor of games that have like two sides to the board. The Emperor chip. Oh, jeez. Is this the same on both sides? I think this is actually the same on both sides. I don't remember anything about that. The counters, good heavy quality. You don't have to do any kind of clipping or even filing. They come out nicely and they're actually firmly in place. The wooden pieces, you get all the bits, and you actually have a choice here on what you get. You get an option to use sort of, I don't know, more specialized pieces like swords for enemies and grain for the grains and little shields for the legions. Or if you don't like that, if you want simplicity, they've got some cubes to go along, that represent the same things. The cards are good quality. Let me talk about the cards a little bit. First of all, the event cards. I do love randomness in a game. This provides a nice level of randomness where you have to prepare yourself so that you're not. You have to take into account the danger of what the random effects might be. They might shake up your plans, so your plans need a little bit more resilience maybe. Other cards, player aids, again a little weaker than I like. I talked about the hidden agendae already, which are kind of nice. Plot cards. These work kind of like a CDG. You have a couple of different things you can do on them. You have an event that you can play them for, or you have a strength value which you can use when you perform resolution of certain actions, which includes combat, but it also includes assassinations. And they're valuable in both ways. So you've got your multi-use and two different types of values on each card, and they're kind of matched. You might not. A high value card probably has a kind of cool event on it. But here's the forum. Each turn, one of these gets drawn, and this is really the worker placement part, because you have things that get filled forever, whereas most of the others don't, and not even for a full turn. They are things you can do as many times as you like. But these give you certain benefits, and so you don't know when you start the game, or even when you start a turn, exactly what's going to be available for you in terms of these special operations that you can take. Your operations are limited to a certain number per turn, usually 2, 3 for the Emperor, and they're also further limited to some extent by your stamina. When you run out of stamina, you get to keep playing that turn, but you die and you lose a victory point. So you kind of don't want to play stamina pieces. These forum cards, what's neat about them is you're making a choice to give up one of your stamina pieces permanently. The earlier in the game you do that, the more it's going to cost you, but the more benefit it may have in certain cases. The other actions, most of them are copyable, which means if you get to do the action, every other player gets to do it. The exceptions to that are assassinations and the Emperor abilities. Obviously, you can't copy things only the Emperor can do. There are a lot of different little neat things you can choose to do in terms of how you want to defend stuff. If you want to defend the Empire overall, spreading the legions out so that the enemies can't show up, and this is why it can't possibly be internal rebellion of another senatorial faction arising or something like that, is because legions are exactly what would turn into the troops in that case. But anyway, you spread them out and you reduce the chances that the barbarians are going to come. You're doing something like the limes. The Emperor has control of that. The Emperor also has control over whether or not a famine is likely to happen by using aqueducts. although there's some trickiness to getting them in play in time. The Emperor gets a pile of victory points for how happy the people are, which is closely tied to success in battle, but also, and more importantly, to how well he feeds the people. He never has enough grain to feed everyone. He's got to buy it from somewhere. Yeah, good luck with that. The amounts of grain that had to be bought, I don't know. You could say the grain that's produced that's from those farms is actually the imperial held grain that was guaranteed to come in or something, and the other grain was stuff you'd have to buy. So, but there's always grain available to buy. The only question is, do you have the money and do you care to? But the Emperor cares about the people's happiness in terms of that's one way he makes victory points. He doesn't have to pay much attention to that, but if he doesn't pay attention to that, he's going to die and lose a victory point. So, as the Emperor, I tended to pay more attention to that, maybe more than I should have. Anyway. Like I said, in terms of gameplay, I found this interesting. It was not a heavy, super strategic decision-making type game. It's more of a reactive game, at least for me. Maybe other people would have a slightly different experience with that. And I favor that kind of game. I don't like one where I have to think too hard. So I appreciated that. Although other people, again, prefer a different, heavier style of game. I enjoy the fact that there are these differences between the starting positions of the different players, and they also have this hidden agenda, which might unbalance things a little bit. It's up to the players to perform just that little bit of additional balance. Now, the hidden agenda is hard to change the balance on. For example, one player had one that was worth 4 points, and the other two players had ones that were worth a maximum of 3 points. Everybody reached their maximum, so he got a bonus off of the card he drew, and it was really that simple. You do have a lot of choices, like building up your engine early on versus attacking enemies. And when you attack enemies successfully, you get cash and other unnamed benefits, which can be very, very important. You also have the capacity to defend and protect your property once it starts getting built. But your starting property is only in Rome, and that can't be hurt. I don't know. Overall, it's interesting. It's a fun Euro. But so what? Yeah, there we're getting into my biases again, where I'm just kind of like, it's not knocking my socks off in any sense of the word. It's good. There's nothing wrong with it. There are some places where I found the rules difficult to understand. There are things that I found my brain unable to remember, which was a serious problem. But for the most part, it just seems to be a good kind of moderately light Euro. But do you need another one? I don't feel like I do. If you're kind of a browser, if you play a game a few times and then move on, maybe. I feel like that kind of browsing, and not just with Euros, with my war games too, is actually biting into my real enjoyment and making me just feel overwhelmed with the number of games I have. Is this doing anything that's just, really stunning me? No. But would I have fun playing it? Yeah. More than I would with most Euros, to be honest. So there you have it. All right, let's send this up.